Hello, everybody, and welcome into the 5th Hidden Track bonus podcast. This is where I go into a topic that we have probably spoken about on the In My Footsteps podcast in the past, typically something that is a part of a top 5 list or another list segment, something that I thought needed a little more digging, a little more love. Funny thing is, these are meant to be bite-sized. I had said 10 to 15 minutes. Every single one of these I've done, the first 4, each one gets a little longer, with the last one topping out at almost 16 minutes. I gotta rein myself in. It's like, why call this bite-sized if they're gonna end up being just as long as everything else? If you haven't listened to any of the Hidden Track podcasts, so far I've spoken about the Isolator helmet and TV hat, the Gilbert Atomic Energy Lab, the telephone booth, and social media sites Friendster and 6 Degrees. For this one, I've got a topic that I first spoke about in episode 181 of the In My Footsteps podcast. It was in a segment called Weird News Stories of the 1960s. And this here is the in-depth story of the man known as the Living Corpse. Yes, you heard that right. The man known as the Living Corpse was Country Bill White. He was an American burial artist. I guess every occupation has a name. He was one of the most unusual entertainers of the 20th century, obviously. He was a country singer and a publicity performer who gained fame for being buried alive for weeks or even months at a time. Bill White toured the United States from the mid-60s through the 1980s, performing endurance burials and promotional stunts, and these are what earned him the nickname the Living Corpse. Throughout his career, his life blended elements of carnival sideshows, country music promotion, Guinness World Records competitions, and more than 60 voluntary burials. Country Bill White was born in 1934 in the Florida Panhandle. There's very little I could find about his childhood. Just know that he grew up in the American South and later became involved in country music performance. His stage persona, Country Bill White, would eventually combine both musical performance and endurance spectacle. By the early 60s, White was working in entertainment circuits connected to country western clubs, drive-in theaters, and roadside attractions. These were fertile grounds for unusual publicity stunts to draw crowds. This is where the burial artist comes into play. Country Bill White got the idea to become a burial artist when he met another such person, Herbert Digger Odell Smith. He was known for voluntarily being buried alive as a stunt, and White met him in 1964, and he was inspired to try to do the same thing. So by this point in his life, Country Bill White was 30 years old. It's interesting to think about meeting, I guess, someone that inspires you and wanting to kind of follow in their footsteps or do what they do. I could think of it for sports, music, art maybe, but not burial artist. Soon after meeting Digger Odell Smith, White staged a burial in Galveston, Texas, where he remained underground for 49 days. He did this so he could break Smith's existing record. That is 7 weeks underground. This success, and I guess the fact that he survived it, launched his career as a traveling attraction. He would then be billed under several nicknames: the Living Corpse, the Human Corpse, and the Funeral Singer, which I guess that makes it for country singing. He toured the U.S., allowing himself to be buried at such locations as drive-in theaters, bars and country music venues, auto dealerships, strip clubs, and fairs. You imagine going to a car dealership to buy a car and there's just like some dude buried underground nearby? Naturally, businesses paid him to do this because the spectacle attracted media attention and crowds, and you figure some of them might spend money when they wouldn't have shown up there. Fair warning to anyone who's claustrophobic, let's find out what it was like being buried alive. Close your eyes, unless you're driving. Country Bill White's coffins were usually custom plywood boxes, 3 by 3 by 6 feet, barely larger than a standard coffin. Now, despite the claustrophobic environment, these boxes included ventilation shafts that supplied oxygen, tubes to lower food and water, microphones or telephones for communication, sometimes a clear window so spectators could view him, and he had a foam mattress for sleeping. Sounds not bad, except for the fact that you probably couldn't move much. Food was lowered through the ventilation tube, often in disposable cups, and luckily there were guards above ground to monitor the burial. Because the first thing I thought of when hearing this is like, what about at night if someone just came up and just poured dirt down the tube and just buried him for real? In later years, White sometimes had a radio or television and telephone in his underground coffin. So he wasn't really roughing it, but that's not to say there was not some occupational hazards of being buried alive. There was one time in Waco, Texas that heavy rain seeped into the coffin and he had to be dug up because it was flooding. One time he was running out of oxygen. They had to lower him a mask down while digging him out. At one event, the weight of the dirt caused the lid to cave in. My favorite when researching this was that someone sometime dropped a boa constrictor down the ventilation shaft. It's like, I thought you had a guard there. You didn't notice someone walking up with a snake to throw it down the tube at this guy? There were always risks, but he kept on doing it. During his career, Country Bill White spent a lot of time underground. His records that he set included 1967 in Largo, Florida. It was 56 days. He broke that in 1968 in Austin, Texas, doing 63 days. He broke that again in 1978 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, lasting just over 134 days. And finally, he set the Guinness World Record in 1981 in Killeen, Texas, at 140 days underground. That is well over 4.5 months. In total, White accumulated more than 2 years of his life spent buried underground. This is where parents that are worried about their kids playing video games too much, it always could be worse. You might not want them playing Fortnite for that long, but it's better than them being buried underground for 4 months. But now we get into the part of the story that was what made it into my Weird Stories of the 1960s segment on the podcast, and that is his marriage to Lottie Howard. While performing these burial stunts in Texas in the mid-1960s, White began communicating with a woman who was repeatedly calling his underground telephone during one of his events. This woman, named Lottie Howard, soon became a part of his act. She volunteered to also be buried alive and was promoted as Mrs. Living Corpse. This is where the couple staged one of the strangest weddings in history. Howard remained buried underground in her coffin. White and a justice of the peace stood above her grave. She reached her hand through a slot in the burial structure, and White placed a ring on her finger. So he married her while she was buried. There were 6 witnesses at the ceremony, which took place June 9th, 1966. You will be shocked to find out that a wedding that started off with one person being buried underground did not last. They were divorced in 1968, and the divorce papers were served to White while he was buried underground. They were sent down the shaft to him. Do you imagine you're in this 3 by 3 by 6 coffin underground, and here comes divorce papers, and what are you gonna do? I mean, I guess it was kind of amicable. The wife could have just put a cork in his tube and then just let him suffocate. Over the course of his life, Country Bill White married 7 times. I could not find if any of the other ones happened while he or his wife were buried. Later on in his life, some of Country Bill White's stunts were charitable. In 1986, he buried himself in Florida to raise money for children's organ transplants. And while buried in his coffin, he sang a song he had written for the child whose medical treatment inspired the fundraiser. I am assuming he just sung and someone had a guitar up above ground. Despite that charitable event in 1986, White retired from the burial stunts in 1981, pretty much. He did 60, and it was the extreme physical and psychological strain of the stunt, combined with increasing safety concerns. Because by this point, he was almost 50. I couldn't imagine me, almost 50, bury me for 4 months underground. We'll see what happens. It's like, I would just be dead there. They just seal me up and be like, well, that saved money. Country Bill White disappeared from public attention after retiring from his burials. He died at the age of 72 in 2006. Country Bill White remains one of the most unusual figures in the American sideshow and publicity stunt history. His legacy includes more than 60 voluntary burials, more than 2 cumulative years spent underground, multiple endurance records recognized by Guinness, and his underground wedding to Lottie Howard. It's like he made the burial artist famous, but then also kind of killed it, because the Guinness Book of World Records stopped promoting those things for safety concerns. It really is incredible to see the kind of oddities that people can get famous for. I was trying to find out what happened to Lottie Howard, Mrs. Living Corpse. I can't find anything about her besides the fact that she married Country Bill White and then divorced him. I'm assuming she went to live a quiet life. She did not continue the tradition of being buried alive like her ex-husband. The joke now among journalists is that Country Bill White has set his own record for the longest time being buried alive. He's now been buried alive for almost 20 years. If you had money to spend or waste, Country Bill White does have an album that you can find. It's very rare, from 1981. It's called Country Bill White Meets Don Glass. There are 11 songs on the album. That's as much digging as I'm willing to do into Country Bill White's music, not to be confused with Billy White, who's another musician. But there you go, the life and times of the living corpse, Country Bill White, country singer, burial artist, married 7 times, including once while his bride-to-be was in a coffin underground. So that wraps up the 5th and probably the weirdest so far Hidden Track podcast. I've got dozens of more topics just pulled from the archives of the In My Footsteps podcasts. Things I go through my notes, I'm like, oh, I want to talk about that more. So I hope you enjoy these. Even the 5 combined, including this one, they're less than an hour and a half for 5 episodes. They're meant to be literally like snack size, hidden tracks. You play the whole CD, it's silent for 10 minutes, suddenly there's a new song. Stay tuned to the main podcast, and I'll be back at some point in the future with a 6th Hidden Track podcast. But that's all for now. I've been Christopher Setterland, but you already knew that, and I'll talk to you all again soon.